The high, narrow windows of the church hall did little to soften the New Mexico sun, which fell in dusty, unforgiving bars across the long plank tables. It was the third Sunday of the month, the day of the church supper, and the air was thick with the scent of baked beans, boiled coffee, and sanctimonious judgment. For 2 years, Nora Vance had endured this ritual. She would arrive just as the pastor finished his blessing, fill a plate with a little of whatever was offered, and find the emptiest corner of the room. She was a ghost at the feast, a solitary figure in a plain gray dress, her presence tolerated but never welcomed. Calvary Creek was a town that held its own close and viewed outsiders with a deep, abiding suspicion. Nora, a widow who had arrived on the stagecoach with one trunk and a past she never spoke of, was the perpetual outsider. The women of the town, clustered in their familial groups, spoke in low, conspiratorial tones, their laughter like the clinking of loose stones. They were wives and mothers, their identities as solid and unmovable as the adobe walls of their homes. Nora was simply a widow, a title that in this town felt less like a circumstance and more like an accusation. Her husband, Thomas, had died of a fever on the trail west, his dream of a small plot of land buried with him in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Texas Panhandle. She had continued on to Calvary Creek, the destination he had spoken of with such hope, only to find herself adrift in a sea of indifferent faces. She made her living with her needle, her fine, even stitches the only thing about her the town's women seemed to respect, and even then, they treated their transactions with the cool efficiency of a necessary but unpleasant chore. Tonight, the noise of the hall seemed louder, the stares more pointed. Mrs. Eleanor Abernathy, wife of the town's most prosperous rancher, held court near the pot-belly stove, her voice a sharp, carrying thing that cut through the general hum. Nora kept her eyes fixed on her plate of dry cornbread and stringy beef stew. She ate slowly, making each bite last, prolonging the moment before she would have to rise and walk the gauntlet of eyes back to the door and out into the lonely twilight. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the silent questions, the unspoken condemnations. Why was she here? Why didn't she move on? Where were her people? These were questions she had no answers for, or at least none she was willing to give. Her people were gone, scattered by hardship and death like seeds on barren ground. She was all that was left. A chair scraped against the rough floorboards opposite her. Nora didn't look up, assuming it was a child or someone momentarily setting down a plate. But the silence stretched. The presence did not leave. It was a solid, heavy thing, displacing the air around her. She could feel the subtle shift in the room's attention, a focusing of energy on her small, isolated table. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her head. He was a cowboy. That much was clear from the worn denim and the faint scent of horse and leather that clung to him. He was not one of the local ranch hands she recognized. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of long days and vast, empty spaces. Dark hair fell over a brow that was creased not with anger, but with a kind of permanent contemplation. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they met hers without flinching, without pity, without any of the veiled curiosity she was so used to. He simply looked at her, a man looking at a woman who happened to be sitting at the same table. He had a plate of his own, piled high. He picked up his fork and speared a piece of beef. The silence between them was a strange, charged thing, no longer empty, but filled with a potent awareness. The chatter in the hall faltered, then resumed, but its pitch had changed. It was now laced with frantic whispers. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt exposed, a specimen pinned under glass. What did he want? Was this some kind of cruel joke, a dare from the other men lingering by the door? He chewed his food deliberately, his gaze dropping to his plate. He seemed utterly unconcerned with the stir he was causing. After a long moment, he swallowed and looked at her again. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Ma'am," he said, the word a simple acknowledgement of her presence. Nora could only nod, her throat tight. He ate another bite. This stew could use some salt. It was such an ordinary observation, so devoid of malice or hidden meaning, that it startled her. She found her own voice, a reedy, unused thing. "The salt is usually on the serving table." He nodded, but made no move to get it. Too far to walk. He gestured with his fork toward her untouched cornbread. "You going to eat that?" She pushed the small plate toward him. "No," she whispered. He took it without another word. They finished their meal in that profound silence, surrounded by the rising tide of speculation. Every eye in the room was on them. Nora felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck, a mixture of shame and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of defiance. She was still an outcast, but for the first time, she was not alone in her isolation. When he had cleaned his plate, he pushed his chair back and stood, his height casting a long shadow over the table. She braced herself for his departure, for the return to solitude. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Jesse Holt," he said, by way of introduction. Then he did the last thing she ever expected. "You save me this seat next month?" Nora stared at him, bewildered. She searched his face for any sign of mockery, but found none. There was only a quiet seriousness in his gray eyes. She didn't know what possessed her to agree, whether it was shock or a desperate, foolish grasp at human connection. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. He gave a short, decisive nod, obliged. And with that, he turned and walked out of the hall, his stride long and steady, leaving Nora Vance sitting in the center of a storm of silence he had created. For the first time in 2 years, the loneliness that awaited her outside felt different, less a certainty and more a question. The month that followed was a study in subtle shifts. The wind did not change direction overnight, but its currents were altered. When Nora walked to the mercantile for thread, the glances she received were no longer merely dismissive. They were sharp with a new, hungry curiosity. The whispers that had once been about her sad, solitary state were now laced with Jesse Holt's name. Who was he? He wasn't a local. He worked, it was rumored, for the big Double H ranch north of the county line, a place known for hiring men who were as hard and unforgiving as the land they worked. He was a man of no family, no connections to Calvary Creek, which made his choice to sit with her all the more baffling to the town's rigid social architects. Nora found herself replaying the brief encounter in her mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. "You save me this seat next month." It was a question, not a command, yet it had held the weight of a promise. She wrestled with its meaning in the quiet solitude of her small 2-room adobe at the edge of town. The house was Thomas's dream, bought with the last of their money, but it had become her refuge and her prison. Its thick walls muted the sounds of the world, but they also amplified the silence of her life. She would sit by the window in the evenings, her sewing idle in her lap, and watch the sky bleed from cobalt to bruised purple over the distant mesas. She had thought she had grown accustomed to the ache of being alone, had mistaken resignation for peace. Jesse Holt's intrusion had disturbed that fragile truce. It had planted a seed of impossible hope in the barren soil of her heart. Was it a cruel game? The thought haunted her. Perhaps he was a man who enjoyed upsetting the delicate balance of a small town, and she was merely the instrument of his amusement. The possibility stung more than the years of quiet shunning. To be used as a pawn would be a far deeper humiliation. The women who brought her mending now lingered at her door, their questions veiled as casual chatter. "That was a surprise, seeing you with company at the supper," one might say, her eyes probing for a story. "Does Mr. Holt have business in town?" Nora offered them nothing, her replies brief and non-committal. She would not give them the satisfaction of her uncertainty. She would guard the memory of that strange supper, holding it close like a secret treasure or a potential wound. As the next third Sunday approached, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Should she go? If she stayed home, the town would decide he had abandoned her, confirming her status as an untouchable. They would feast on her humiliation. If she went and he did not appear, the result would be the same, only she would have to suffer it publicly. The walk to the church hall would be an act of either faith or foolishness, and she wasn't sure which. She spent the day in a fever of indecision, cleaning her small house with a frantic energy, scrubbing floors that were already clean, polishing a window that only looked out onto dust and scrub brush. When evening fell, she stood before the small silvered mirror in her bedroom. The woman who looked back at her seemed tired, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with a familiar sorrow. She had braided her dark hair and pinned it up with severe neatness. Her gray dress was clean and pressed, but it was the uniform of her widowhood, a color that allowed her to fade into the background. Tonight, the idea of fading was no longer an option. By sitting at her table, Jesse Holt had inadvertently drawn a circle around her, and now all of Calvary Creek was watching to see if he would step inside it again. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady her trembling hands, she draped her worn shawl over her shoulders and walked out into the cool desert air. The church hall was already full when she arrived, the noise and warmth spilling out into the twilight. She paused at the doorway, her courage faltering. Every head seemed to turn in her direction. She saw Eleanor Abernathy standing with her daughter Clara, a pretty girl with her mother's hard eyes. Mrs. Abernathy's gaze swept over Nora with dismissive appraisal before she turned to whisper something to her daughter, a cruel smile touching her lips. Nora's resolve hardened. She would not give them the victory of her retreat. Lifting her chin, she walked to her usual table in the corner. It was empty, an island in the crowded room. She sat, her back straight, her hands folded primly in her lap, and began the long, agonizing wait. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The pastor said his blessing, and the line formed for food. People moved around her table as if it were cursed, leaving a wide, empty space. Nora did not move to get a plate. Her appetite had vanished, replaced by a cold dread. He was not coming. It had been a joke after all, a moment of whimsy for a passing cowboy. She felt the blood drain from her face, the stares of the other diners like physical blows. She was preparing to stand, to endure the final, humiliating walk out of the hall, when the doors swung open again. Jesse Holt stood there, silhouetted against the deepening dusk. He took a moment to survey the room, his expression calm, unhurried. His gaze found her, and a flicker of something, recognition, confirmation, passed through his gray eyes. He gave a slight nod to the pastor, then made his way through the crowded room, his path as direct and unwavering as a river's course. He ignored the Abernathys, who stood directly in his path. He bypassed the table of ranchers who called out a greeting to him. He walked straight to her table. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, placing his hat on the empty seat beside him. The whispers in the room died instantly, replaced by a thick, shocked silence. He looked at her, then at her empty hands. "You haven't eaten," he stated, his voice low. "I wasn't hungry," she managed to say. "A person's got to eat," he stood again. "I'll get you a plate." He returned with 2 plates, both generously filled. He set one in front of her and sat down again, picking up his fork. He didn't speak of his lateness, nor did he acknowledge the palpable tension in the room. He simply began to eat, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. As if they were 2 people sharing a quiet meal, alone in a room of 100. Nora picked up her own fork. Her hands were shaking, but she took a bite of stew. This time, it tasted of more than just salt and beef. It tasted of defiance. The third supper established the pattern. It was no longer a question of if Jesse Holt would appear, but of how the town would react. The Abernathy family, the self-appointed arbiters of Calvary Creek's social order, took his continued presence at Nora's table as a personal affront. Eleanor Abernathy, a woman whose charity was always transactional, saw in Jesse a potential asset. He was a skilled and respected foreman at the Double H, a man of quiet authority whose favor could benefit her husband's ambitions to expand his own ranching empire. More pressingly, he was unattached, a prime candidate for her daughter Clara. That such a man would choose the company of a penniless, unconnected widow over the town's most eligible young woman was not just an anomaly, it was an insult. The pressure began subtly. Eleanor Abernathy cornered Nora one morning in the dry goods store, her smile as brittle as spun glass. "Mrs. Vance," she began, her voice dripping with false concern, "it is so good to see you looking less burdened." She patted Nora's arm with a proprietary air. "We were all so worried for you, but you must be careful. A man like Mr. Holt, a rough man from a rough world, can have intentions that are not always clear. A woman in your delicate position cannot afford any hint of scandal." The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in the guise of friendly advice. Nora simply met her gaze, her own expression unreadable, and replied with a quiet, "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Abernathy," before turning back to a purchase of flour. The dismissal, polite as it was, did not go unnoticed. The snubs became more overt. Women who had previously offered curt greetings now looked straight through her. A commission to sew a new Sunday dress for a merchant's wife was abruptly canceled without explanation. The circle of her isolation, once a passive consequence of her status, was now being actively drawn tighter, a deliberate effort to starve her out, socially and economically. Nora felt the chill of it in her bones. There were days she considered packing her single trunk and taking the next stagecoach to nowhere, simply to escape the suffocating weight of their disapproval. But then she would think of Jesse Holt's steady gray eyes and the simple, declarative fact of his presence. He had asked her to save his seat. It was a small thing, a fragile thread of connection, but it was the only one she had. To run would be to break it, to prove the town right, that she was transient, insignificant, a woman easily chased away. One sweltering afternoon, as she was tending to the small, struggling vegetable patch behind her house, she heard the steady rhythm of a hammer. She looked up to see Jesse Holt at her front gate, resetting a fence post that had been leaning precariously for months. He hadn't asked. He hadn't announced himself. He had simply seen a thing that needed fixing and set about fixing it. She watched him for a long time from her kitchen window, his movements economical and sure. He worked with a quiet competence that seemed to be the very core of his being. When he was finished, he tested the post with his weight, his satisfaction a small, tight nod. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and drew a cool glass of water from the well. She carried it out to him, her heart beating a nervous rhythm. She had never seen him outside the charged atmosphere of the church hall. Here, in the clear, bright sunlight, he seemed both larger and more real. "Thank you," she said, holding out the glass. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. He drank the entire glass in one long draught, the muscles in his throat working. He handed the empty glass back to her. "Post was loose," he said, as if that explained everything. "I know, I hadn't the strength to fix it properly." He looked at her then, his gaze taking in the faint smudges of dirt on her cheek, the weary set of her shoulders. Some things a person shouldn't have to do alone. It was the most he had ever said to her at one time. The words hung in the still air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. They weren't just talking about a fence post. He looked past her, at the small, tidy house, at the parched garden. He understood, she realized with a sudden clarity. He understood the relentless effort it took just to hold her small world together. He saw not the pitiful widow, but the woman fighting a quiet, daily war against entropy and despair. He did not offer pity. He offered the simple, profound dignity of recognition. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, and swung himself up onto his horse. She watched him ride away, the dust rising in his wake, and felt the ground beneath her own feet feel, for the first time in a very long time, solid and sure. The fourth supper was a declaration of war. By now, the town had divided into factions. Most sided with the Abernathys, their loyalty dictated by social standing and economic dependence. A few, however, watched with a grudging respect for the Cowboy's quiet defiance. The atmosphere in the hall was electric with tension. As Nora entered, a hush fell over the room. She walked to her table, her steps even, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the hostile stares. She sat and waited. This time, Eleanor Abernathy did not rely on whispers. She decided on a direct assault. As Jesse Holt entered the hall, she moved to intercept him, her daughter Clara at her side like a well-groomed show pony. A place had been conspicuously set for him at the Abernathy table, a strategic move designed to force a public choice. "Mr. Holt," Eleanor trilled, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "We saved a place for you. My husband is so eager to discuss the new grazing leases with you." Jesse stopped. He removed his hat, holding it in both hands before him. The entire hall held its breath. This was the moment of reckoning. Nora's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. She could not bring herself to watch, staring instead at the whorls in the wooden tabletop. Jesse looked from Eleanor's expectant face to Clara's hopeful one. He gave them a slow, polite nod. "Mrs. Abernathy, Miss Clara." His voice was even, betraying no emotion. "That's a kindness." Then, without another word, he placed his hat back on his head, stepped around them as if they were nothing more than a mild obstruction, and continued his unwavering path to Nora's table. The collective gasp in the room was almost comical. Eleanor Abernathy's face, a moment before wreathed in confident smiles, froze in a mask of pure fury. It was a public, undeniable rejection. Jesse sat down opposite Nora, the scrape of his chair the only sound in the cavernous silence. He looked at her, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Evening, Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and felt a warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the chill of the room. "Evening, Jesse," she replied, her own voice steady. They ate their meal as the town erupted in a furious buzz of whispers around them. The Abernathys had been challenged, their authority flouted. The battle lines had been drawn, and Nora and Jesse sat together in the quiet center of the storm, a silent partnership forged in the face of public condemnation. The food was tasteless in her mouth, but she felt nourished all the same. She was no longer just an object of pity or scorn. She was a choice, and the man who had chosen her was not easily moved. The public humiliation at the supper was more than the Abernathy pride could bear. Arthur Abernathy, a man whose influence was built on the perception of unassailable power, could not let the Cowboy's silent defiance stand. If social pressure and strategic invitations had failed, he would resort to cruder, more effective weapons. He would not attack Jesse Holt directly. The man was respected, and his employers at the Double H were powerful. Instead, he would destroy the reason for Holt's rebellion. He would make Nora Vance so toxic, so utterly beyond the pale, that even a man like Holt would be forced to abandon her to save his own reputation. The rumor started, as such things do, as a poison whispered into a willing ear. It was delivered to the town's most inveterate gossip over a bolt of calico at the Mercantile, a story supposedly relayed by a traveling salesman who had passed through the very town in Kansas from which Nora had come. The story was a vile tapestry woven from threads of half-truth and outright fabrication. It claimed that Nora's husband hadn't died of a fever, but of shame. It hinted at debts, at a gambling problem, and darkest of all, at Nora's own infidelity. It painted her not as a grieving widow seeking refuge, but as a disgraced woman who had fled a past of her own making. To complete the narrative, the story suggested she had come to Calvary Creek with the specific intent of trapping a new man, a provider to settle the debts her husband had left behind. The poison spread quickly, seeping into the foundations of the town. It was exactly what the people needed to justify their initial coldness, a satisfying explanation for their long-held baseless suspicion. She was not a victim, she was a predator. Her quiet demeanor was not modesty, it was cunning. Her poverty was not a misfortune, it was a punishment. The story validated their cruelty, transforming it into righteous judgment. Nora felt the shift almost immediately. The averted glances became looks of open contempt. Children on the street, sensing the change in their parents, would sometimes call out names as she passed. "There she goes," a boy might yell, emboldened by the safety of his friends. The word "Black Widow" reached her ears one afternoon, a stone thrown from the shadows that struck her with more force than any physical object. Her sewing work, which had merely dwindled before, now dried up completely. No respectable woman in Calvary Creek would allow a dress stitched by such hands to touch her skin. Her small savings began to shrink. She ate less, thinning her stews with more water, making her bread last longer. The hunger was a dull ache in her stomach, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing pain of the town's hatred. The loneliness she had known before was a quiet, empty room. This was a prison, with jeering faces pressed against the bars. She stopped going to the mercantile unless absolutely necessary, timing her trips for early morning when the streets were empty. Her world shrank to the four walls of her adobe house and the dusty patch of garden out back. She wondered if Jesse had heard the rumors. Of course he had. In a town this small, a story that vicious traveled faster than a prairie fire. She imagined the men at the ranch, repeating the gossip over their evening meal, laughing, making crude jokes. She imagined them telling Jesse he was a fool, that the quiet widow he was defending was nothing but a common cheat. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until it was difficult to breathe. He would not come to the next supper. She was certain of it. No man would endure such disgrace for a woman he barely knew. The arrangement was over. The Abernathys had won. On the day of the fifth supper, Nora did not even consider going. She bolted her door and sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her hands. They were chapped and thin, but they were honest hands. They had nursed her husband, buried her parents, and earned every penny she had ever had. And now they were idle, deemed unclean by the town. A tear slid down her cheek, then another. The despair she had held at bay for 2 long years finally broke through her defenses, and she bowed her head and wept, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. She cried for her lost Thomas, for the life they were supposed to have, for the crushing, relentless injustice of her situation. A sharp knock on the door startled her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. No one ever came to her door. "Go away," she whispered, the words lost in the small room. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Nora!" It was his voice. "Jesse!" Her heart leaped into her throat. She frantically wiped her eyes with the back of her hands, but she could not bring herself to move, to answer the door. What could she possibly say to him? How could she face him, knowing the ugly things he must have heard? "Nora!" he said again, his voice closer now, just outside the window. "I know you're in there. The supper's starting soon. I came to walk you." To walk her. The simple, chivalrous phrase was so at odds with the ugliness that surrounded them that it almost made her laugh. Or cry again. She still did not move. There was a long silence. She heard the soft creak of leather as he shifted his weight. She thought he would leave. She almost hoped he would. It would be easier. But he stayed. She could feel his presence on the other side of the door, as solid and patient as the mountains on the horizon. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and devoid of any judgment. "They can say what they want. It don't make it true. I'll be waiting out here, when you're ready." She listened to the sound of his footsteps moving to the edge of her small porch, then the soft sigh of him sitting down on the top step. He was waiting. In full view of the whole town, he was sitting on her porch, waiting for the disgraced woman to show her face. He was making his stand here, now, not in the church hall, but at her very doorstep. He wasn't just saving her a seat anymore. He was guarding her home. Slowly, shakily, Nora rose from her chair, her tears forgotten. She smoothed her dress, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked toward the door. She opened the door to a world bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. Jesse sat on her porch step, his back to her, looking out at the road that led into town. He did not seem surprised when the door opened. He simply stood, turned, and looked at her. He didn't ask if she had been crying. He didn't mention the rumors. His gray eyes were steady, and in their depths, she saw not a reflection of the town's gossip, but a reflection of herself as he saw her. A woman of substance, a woman worth waiting for. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She pulled the door shut behind her, the click of the latch sounding like a final, decisive act. She had made her choice. They walked together down the dusty track toward the church, not speaking. The town was quiet, the residents already gathered for the supper. Their footsteps were the only sound, a steady, rhythmic beat against the earth. It was the longest walk of Nora's life. Every window they passed felt like an eye, every curtained shadow a witness. But for the first time, she did not feel alone in the glare. Jesse's presence beside her was a shield. He walked with his customary long, easy stride, his shoulders back, his gaze fixed forward, the very picture of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. He did not hold her arm or offer any overt gesture of protection. He did not need to. His proximity was enough. It was a silent, public declaration that dwarfed any whispered lie. When they reached the church hall, the sound from within ceased abruptly as they stepped through the door. If the silence had been thick on previous occasions, it was now a solid, suffocating wall. Every single person was staring. At the head of the room, Arthur Abernathy stood near the pulpit, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He had been in the middle of a speech, no doubt, laying the groundwork for Nora's final excommunication. Her arrival, and especially her escort, had clearly caught him off guard. Nora's steps faltered. The sheer force of so much concentrated animosity was a physical blow. She felt Jesse's hand come to rest lightly on the small of her back, a brief, firm pressure that was both a steadying influence and a silent command. Keep walking. She drew strength from the touch, straightened her spine, and moved forward. They walked the length of the hall, through the sea of hostile faces, to their table. The journey felt as though it took a year. Jesse pulled out her chair for her, a gesture of old-world courtesy that was also an act of breathtaking defiance in this place, at this moment. He waited until she was seated before taking his own chair. Arthur Abernathy, recovering his composure, cleared his throat loudly, determined to regain control of the room and his narrative. "As I was saying," he began, his voice booming with false piety, "it is the duty of a righteous community to uphold its standards. We must be vigilant against moral decay, which can be brought into our midst by those with unsettled histories. We must protect the flock from the wolf that wears sheep's clothing." His eyes bored into Nora, his meaning as subtle as a branding iron. The room was breathless with anticipation. This was it, the public denunciation. Everyone waited for Jesse Holt's reaction. They expected him to finally see his error, to stand up and walk away from the tainted woman, to distance himself from the scandal. They expected him to save himself. Jesse did not even look at Abernathy. He calmly reached for the basket of bread that sat in the middle of the table. He took a piece, broke it in half, and placed one of the halves on Nora's empty plate. Then he picked up the ladle from the large tureen of stew that had been placed on their table and began to fill her bowl. His movements were slow, deliberate, each one an answer to Abernathy's venomous speech. He was not engaging in the fight on Abernathy's terms. He was ignoring it completely. He was choosing a different reality, one in which two people were simply sharing a meal, and the rest of the world, with its noise and its judgment, did not exist. His utter dismissal of Abernathy's attack was more powerful than any angry rebuttal could ever have been. It rendered the man's pompous speech impotent, ridiculous. Abernathy's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He had orchestrated this grand moral execution, and his target's supposed protector was calmly serving her dinner. The power Abernathy wielded was rooted in fear and social compliance, and Jesse Holt was demonstrating that he was immune to both. A few nervous coughs broke the silence. Someone at a nearby table tentatively resumed a whispered conversation. The spell was broken. Jesse finished serving Nora, then filled his own bowl. He met her eyes across the table, his own gaze clear and unwavering. "Eat," he said softly. It was not a command, but an invitation. An invitation to be nourished, to be restored, to live. Nora picked up her spoon. Her hand was perfectly steady. She took a bite of the stew, and it was the most satisfying meal she had ever tasted. Arthur Abernathy, sputtering and speechless, his grand moment ruined, finally sat down in a huff, defeated not by a shout, but by a whisper of civility. The quietest man in the room had proven to be the strongest. The rest of the meal passed in a strange, muted peace. The storm had broken over them, and they had not been washed away. The whispers continued around them, but they had lost their sharp, vicious edge. They were now tinged with confusion, with grudging awe. with the dawning realization that the Abernathys were not invincible. By refusing to be shamed, Nora and Jesse had stripped the town's judgment of its power. It was just noise, the meaningless chatter of people who mistook cruelty for strength. Nora ate every bite of her food. With each spoonful, she felt a piece of herself, a piece she thought had been lost forever, being restored. Her dignity. It had not been given to her by Jesse. He had simply created the space for her to reclaim it as her own. When they were finished, Jesse pushed back his chair and stood. The room quieted once more, watching. He did not look at anyone else. He looked only at her. He held out his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, a hand that knew the feel of rope and leather and hard work. It was a steady hand. Nora looked at it for a long moment, then placed her own hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. Together, they stood and walked out of the church hall. They did not rush. Their steps were measured and graceful, the exit of guests who had finished their meal, not the flight of vanquished pariahs. They left the whispers and the stares and the defeated fury of the Abernathys behind them, sealed in the stuffy, overheated room. Outside, the night air was cool and clean, smelling of dust and creosote and the vast, empty spaces of the desert. 1,000,000 stars were scattered across the black velvet of the sky, distant and serene. They walked in a comfortable silence, his hand still holding hers. It felt natural, right. They passed the mercantile, its windows dark. They passed the blacksmith shop, the forge cold for the night. They walked through the town that had tried to break her, and she felt no fear, only a profound and quiet sense of peace. When they reached her small house, he stopped at the gate he had mended. He released her hand, though she felt the warmth of his touch linger. In the starlight, she could see the lines of his face, the quiet strength in his eyes. He had not fought her battle for her. He had simply stood with her while she fought it herself. He had given her the one thing she had not had in 2 years, an ally. "Thank you, Jesse," she said, her voice full of an emotion too deep for words. He just nodded, his gaze gentle. "Get some rest, Nora." He waited until she had unlocked her door and stepped inside, until she had lit the lamp that cast a warm, welcoming glow from her window. Only then did he turn and walk away, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness. Nora stood by her window and watched him go. She was no longer Nora Vance, the solitary widow. She was no longer defined by what she had lost or by what the town thought of her. She had been tested by fire, and she had not burned. The house was no longer a prison, but a home, a sanctuary. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she would not be sitting alone at the supper ever again. The cowboy had sat down, and in doing so, had given her a place to stand.